Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another installment of the Diversity and Talent webinar series brought to you by your Grand Rapids Chamber. My name is Atal Bandi, and I serve as the Vice President of Business and Talent Development here at the Chamber. And we are excited to be with you today and bring you something a little bit different from the typical of our webinar series. But first, we just want to say thank you to our sponsors. Our premier sponsor, Spartan Nash. Event underwriters are Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, Ovell Health, and Gentex Corporation. Executive sponsors, Amway, Grand Rapids Community College, Meyer Mercantile Bank, and Trinity Health. And chamber champions are AHC Hospitality, Chase Creative, Earhart Construction, Gerald R. Ford International Airport, MSU College of Human Medicine, and Rockford Construction. Now, as I mentioned, this month we are doing things a little differently as we have a special guest who just released a book. And so today, my friend, brother, and everyone's favorite uncle, Ovell Barbee, is in the house with us, and who is a human resource strategist and owner of Ovell Rome and Associates. Now, he also authored the book, The Big House, a human-centered and progressive approach to DEI and positive workforce engagement, which we will be having a book signing right here at the Chamber following the webinar. So there is still time to get here. We have a space here if you want to come and listen live here in-house. And then Ovell will be downstairs signing books as well. Before we get into the Q&A, I want to read a thank you that a reader penned to Ovell after reading this book. And I really, really love what she wrote, because I actually echo some of her sentiments. So I'm going to read that real quick before we get into the interview here. She says, Mr. Barbee, I have tried to find the words to convey concerning your book, and I keep coming up with thank you. Thank you for being you. Thank you for using your voice, sharing your experiences, and for unapologetically letting young Black professionals like myself know that you see us, you get us, and will continue to push, drive, change. I remember meeting you when you were at IU Health. I was a new hire, and I was shocked when I learned that you took time to come down to our suite and meet team members. It was the first time I've ever met a CHRO, and your spirit was welcoming. I was inspired and felt a little at ease in my new role. I was excited to benefit from your leadership. I was saddened to learn of your departure, however, 1 year later. I can truly understand why you no longer are there. I fought back tears as I read The Big House, because in my 15-year career in HR, I resonate with some of the same feelings, thoughts, and experiences that you have faced. You've given me plenty of gems to treasure on this corporate journey, and more importantly, motivation to use my voice to keep moving forward. I also grew up in a Baptist church, and I'm reminded of the song, if I can help somebody as I travel along, if I can help somebody in a word or a song, if I can help somebody from doing wrong, no, my living shall not be in vain. Mr. Barbee, your living is not in vain. You are a blessing to corporate America and to people in general. Thank you. Ovell is a renowned, visionary human resource leader, consultant, and speaker with a passion for diversity, equity, and inclusion. He's held executive leadership roles at Fortune 500 companies in an array of industries, including Motorola, Blue Cross Blue Shield, General Motors, OnStar, Corewell Health, and Indiana University Health. In these roles, he drove sustained cultural change and reduced barriers for diverse populations with a human-centered approach that addresses systemic and unconscious barriers and bias. He implemented policies and practices allowing everyone opportunities to thrive within a corporate culture. We are so excited to have him this morning. And with that, I want to welcome Mr. Ovell Barbee.
Thank you, Ata, for a great introduction. Appreciate the kind words.
I almost want to say it wasn't enough, knowing what I know about you. But for starters, for people that don't know you, can you tell us a bit about Ovell R. Barbee Jr.?
Well, being here in Michigan, typically as I travel around the country, I always raise my hand and to resemble Michigan and point to my city of origin. I don't have to do that for the audience, but I'm actually born and raised in Grand Rapids. This is my hometown. I was born at Blodgett Hospital back in the day. I grew up across the street from what is now known as Martin Luther King Park. There is a chapter in the book called Lessons from the Park, highlighting all of the many things that I learned a lot of survival skills at that park. I went to and graduated from Creston High School. Shout out to the Polar Bears who may be listening. And at the time, I was a sprinter in high school and a hurdler. I lettered in track for 4 years. And now I describe myself as a more senior, slower jogger. But I would say that's it in terms of early history in Grand Rapids, which it leads me to being very passionate about community since this is my hometown.
Love it. So the book is called The Big House. And for Michigan fans, we are not talking about that big house. What you speak about in the beginning of chapter 1, for those of African-American descent, the term conjures up images of slavery, oppression, and plantation. What is the inspiration behind naming the book The Big House?
Very interesting in terms of the title, The Big House. I graduated from U of M and Michigan State, and it's an unfortunate set of circumstances in that my experience in corporate America, I experienced things that reminded me of the descriptions of slavery. Mm-hmm. And as I thought about the title of the book, I felt like I had a level of privilege as a leader being part of the corporate or the C-suite, but I always felt a duty and obligation to advocate on behalf of people who looked like me and others who didn't have the seat at the table that I was privileged to have. Mm. And so here lies the challenge. We have a lot of work ahead of us still.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, the book addresses workplace issues and life issues. In the introduction you mentioned, I'll read, "We are often so afraid of the consequences of using our voices to be heard and to speak out against the many injustices perpetrated against us that we sit back and remain silent. This silence serves as a form of approval that the behavior to which we're subjected to is acceptable." And as I read that, I thought about my career and times where I have been silent as well. Can you speak more about the silence and why it is practiced?
Well, I'll give a two-part answer to the whole concept of silence. So in my experience, and I have a lot of experience, it's interesting. Someone on LinkedIn developed a post and they said, I had a meeting with Ovell. He has decades, plural, decades of experience. And what I experienced working in human resource was a lot of people requesting to meet with me. And I always had a rule, I'm going to meet with anyone who requests to meet with me, not knowing oftentimes what the subject matter was. Mm-hmm. And so people would come in and display a range of emotion from anger, sadness, etc., telling me experiences they had on the job. And I would hang on their every word, listening to them tell me the stories. And at the end, a lot of the stories I would ask, oh my God, did you say anything? And most of the time people would tell me that they didn't. And so it was very interesting that there's something about the connection to the job that allows people to not bring their whole self to work to address an injustice that occurs. So much so that I developed a card, and I wish I had the card with me, but the card is an index card that says, use your voice. And under use your voice, it says, I will use my voice too. I found myself giving people those cards to say, I'm encouraging you to say something, to use your voice for the betterment of yourself as an individual and also on behalf of the community. So that's part one of my lengthy answer. The other mantra that is associated with me is stop the silence. And the reason I developed that is interesting because that first surfaced here in Grand Rapids when I was working as a chief diversity officer and preparing for a panel. And during the panel discussion, they wanted me to answer the question, what is the most significant challenge I face as a leader in the DE&I space? And I was like, that it has got to be the most easy question I've ever been answered, right up there with what's 2 + 2, because the answer to the question was silence. And so to display my answer, I literally walked across the stage in front of an audience of people who knew me, and I said nothing. People thought I was having a meltdown, like my PowerPoint wasn't working, all the rescuers, we have to help Ovell. But that was my way of conveying what happens as we start to tackle very challenging topics like racism, discrimination, harassment. The room can go to complete silence. And minus dialogue, there's not going to be any progress. So that was my two-part answer. Use your voice and stop the silence.
I love that. Minus dialogue, there can't be any progress. I remember you and I were talking and you shared a story about one of the book signings you did and about a question that was asked of the audience that really showed you just how prevalent this silence issue is. I don't know if you mind sharing that.
Yeah, I will. It's very interesting how sad that particular scenario was. But I was in a forum and the person was asking the audience, how many of you out there has had something occur at work where you chose not to say something and in hindsight, you should have said something? Literally like 99% of the hands went up, men, women, every age, etc. And me looking at the audience, it was very sad, but it inspired me more in terms of, encouraging people to say something.
And I remember, mentioning that the second question that followed was, how many of you said anything about it? And all the hands, almost all of them seemed to go right back up again. So just such an issue. And so I want to ask a follow-up to that. Is the silence a response to fear? And if that is the case, how does one overcome the fear in speaking out, and especially when there could be consequences?
I think that there's no right or wrong answer to that question. It's a very good question in the book. So hopefully you are encouraged to pick it up. For me as an individual, I was given permission by a leader that I had that I reference in the book. She basically said to me, she said she didn't feel like I was showing up as my authentic self at work. This was a leader that I wasn't enamored with. And she said to me, you're essentially going to be eaten alive in corporate America. I was very young in my career. And she said, what is the worst thing that can happen to you at work? And I had to think about it. I was like, I could be fired. And she said, well, what would you do if you were fired? I said, I would pick myself off the ground, dust myself off, send out my resume, and I would find another job. And she said, for you to be the most effective leader you can be, you have to be okay with the worst possible outcome. And so I felt like my takeaway from that message from her was, am I really self-restricting myself, unnecessarily? And am I truly okay with the worst possible outcome? And once she basically gave me permission, then I started challenging things more that I felt were not supportive of the direction we needed to take, especially as an HR leader, knowing that the implications of workforce strategies and how they impact people. So she basically gave me permission, and it wasn't that I needed to practice bringing my whole self to work. I felt I wasn't at that stage really comfortable doing it.
I think that's powerful that you have a leader that gives you that, not that we need the permission, but gives you the permission to do that. And then how much that can allow us to then use our voice the way we should. It's also interesting, I think, to me, because there's a tool in coaching that says to help motivate people to action, you have them think about the worst possible scenario. And that's exactly what she was doing. So in the book, you speak about structural racism and how systems are in place that perpetuate the essence of inequitable dealings. As pointed out by Kimberly Crenshaw in Critical Race Theory, a lot of it is embedded in our American system. And from your experience, how can an environment be cultivated where diversity and equity are actual elements, especially in colonized society like ours?
So I describe myself as an HR leader who is very passionate about DE&I work. And as
Mhm.
I geared up to learn the space of DE&I, essentially I spent my entire career in human resources as an advocate for DE&I.
Mhm.
In one organization locally, I was asked to also wear the hat of the chief diversity officer. And it was interesting. People have careers in DE and I appreciate their expertise and their willingness to fight on behalf of others. But I had to ramp up as the chief diversity officer. I
Mhm.
had to ask my team questions like, do people want to be called Hispanic or Latino? Help me understand the differences in the LGBTQ space, the utilization of pronouns, BIPOC, critical race theory, etc. I had to learn the space. And one of my biggest objectives was to not offend anyone. So, having said that, in my learning, I really bought into systems thinking in terms of how do you unravel all the years of history leading to the disparate outcomes that we see. And so in my work, I'm definitely a proponent of what I call the three Ps:
Mhm.
your policies, your practices, your procedures, using data as the catalyst. You have to have a willingness to undo those three Ps in terms of those will then lead to better outcomes. So it's very interesting in the DE&I space. If there was a request, I'll use an example that I think resonates with most people. If you said there was a group of children in the winter who needed gloves, almost every hand would go up to say, "I will help.
Mhm.
I'll donate. I'll give gloves, etc."
Mhm.
But as you start having a deeper discussion, what led to these children needing gloves? Is it access? Is it cost? Jobs for the parents? There's a deeper level discussion when you see the data or the need. And so DE&I work, it really is more about the systems piece. That's where we need the collective efforts of all of us weighing in. But as you start having those conversations, you have fewer participants in the conversation. The charity piece, you have the hands going up. The systems piece, that's where you don't have as active as dialogue as you need to move the needle.
You think it's because it takes so much more work, more effort?
I think there's multiple factors that contribute to that.
Okay.
You feel there might be groups as you start talking about equity and giving the groups the intervention that they need to equal the playing field. You may have people who are not part of that group that feels like there's, favoritism, or is that necessary?
Mm.
The long-term goal of all of this work is that we strengthen the community, and that takes our collective efforts. And so a lot of times with the systemic approaches, the results take a little longer. That's where you have the DE and I proponents saying, hurry up. But if you're undoing systems that have been years in the making, it's going to take longer.
Yeah, I love that, your three Ps and really using data to be able to kind of reshape and rebuild those as you go along. You mentioned it as you were answering there that you have kind of taken on this mantle of fighting on behalf of others. So in the book, obviously, you talk about that, and it feels like your life purpose has been advocating for underrepresented people. Is there any merit to that? And how do you get to that place?
I would say how you get there is by having experiences that align with some of the experiences that the people you're advocating on behalf of have also experienced. And so my leadership journey really, it's been like a roller coaster in terms of the experience that I've had, being on every side of the table and being able to relate to those stories. I mentioned me having grown up in Grand Rapids, divorced parents, working since I was 12, all of those have shaped who I am as an individual. And, I had a minister tell me that he felt like my calling was to advocate on behalf of others, and also highlighted his words. He said, "Do you know how rare you are with your willingness to do that?" And for me, I don't give it a second thought. I
Mm.
do think that that is part of my purpose, is to create a level of disruption in corporate America to say we need to do better. I don't have a personal gain in that. I think that the community gains if we can do a better job.
I think that reminds me of, some of the things you were saying at the beginning in terms of like the lessons you learned at the park and, being taught to stand up to the bully and going and figuring out, and then now using the things that you did for yourself to now do for others. So I just love to hear that. You talked a little bit about Miss Lorraine, about the
Mhm.
worst possible outcome. And I can imagine that when you hear that the first time, it's like, man, like, okay, you want me to show up as my full self. Did it take long for you to really own that statement?
I would say yes. It's a great question. People have asked me, from a historical perspective, since I have decades of experience, like, when did you start showing up in terms of like your authentic self as a leader? And certainly Miss Lorraine, the character name in the book, she contributed to that because she gave me permission. And I would say that that was truly a catalyst. But then also me as a leader wanting to be the author to the question that I reference a lot as one of life's most compelling questions, is how will you be remembered? And I don't want anyone else to answer that question except for me. And so owning the pen and being the author was very important in terms of me making, life changes in terms of running in a marathon, paying back my nonprofit scholarships, supporting college students with their books and supplies. Those are things that I would want people to say that were intentional decisions on my part, and looking to the future, hopefully many years from now when that question would be posed.
Love it. So we've got a few more questions that we want to ask Ovell. I want to just kind of make mention that if you have some questions for Ovell, please feel free to put them in the chat. And we'll make sure we try to get some of those questions before our time is done. Another thing that you mentioned in the book is that we can't afford to ignore social justice, not just for ourselves, but for the greater good of society. Can you say more about that?
Gladly. So it is interesting. Hopefully, I won't have to talk about this for years to come. But the aftermath of the George Floyd video was really significant for me, partly because we're in the midst of the pandemic, all the uncertainty, and the push from employees to employers to recognize, you know, all that people were carrying. And because I was working in the DE&I space, I received phone calls from several people. Ovell, I had no idea after watching that video the challenges that people face. What can I do to help you? And I say publicly, privately, I appreciated every phone call that individuals made, because the DE&I space typically lacks resources, and someone raising their hand to say they will assist you is greatly appreciated. But then as I started really reflecting, I was like, man, what has become of our society if it takes watching a 9-minute video of someone being murdered before we decide to raise our hand to be supportive? And I articulated a goal that I established as a speaker, which was that I wanted people to raise their hands sooner by observation. And someone said to me, they said, "Ovell, you should articulate examples of what you mean." And I said, that's a good idea. I'm going to shamelessly use that. So what I mean by that is if you're, at the store and you notice someone with multiple bags, male, female, senior, young, you're the person that decides to hold the door. You hear someone say, call 911 or somebody help me. You're the first person to dial the number. What happened to us, being observant and being supportive, being neighborly, acknowledging people, doing what we could do to help one person. It doesn't mean that we set a course to save the masses, but that's something that I take very seriously. It shouldn't take watching a video before you decide to raise your hand.
Yeah, I love what you mentioned in that portion of the book where you're talking about how we shouldn't always wait for the person to say, hey, I need help.
Say uncle.
To say uncle, right? Like sometimes we need to say uncle for other people.
Right.
And so when we see it, how willing are we to enter into standing with and supporting people that need the help?
Right.
Because as you mentioned, none of this is new.
It's not. Yeah. I mean, yeah, very reflective, the whole space and me thinking of the analogy of say uncle, because it did remind me of the childhood game. If any of the viewers, played that, if you considered it a game where you just, finally had to say, I've had enough. Mm-hmm. So that is, my charge to people listening is, be reflective and think about, opportunities to advocate on behalf of someone else.
Now in the chat, I've put a link. If you're interested in purchasing the book, you can buy it off of that link. I'll also be posting another link here shortly where if you wanted to buy it in bulk, you get a little bit of a break there too. So we want to encourage you to check those out. Also want to put out there again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'd be happy to present them to Ovell while we still have them. In the title, you also talk about a human-centered approach. Tell me why that is important.
Very interesting working in human resources. We use the word human, and I think that as we look to a future vision for human resources, we have to be very mindful as we establish practices, policies, procedures that we're talking about human beings. We shouldn't even have to remind people of that. But as people have described my leadership style, I smiled, and people say, Ovell, you smile a lot when people say that Ovell has a human-centered approach in terms of his leadership style. And that's something that, I have never taken for granted as an HR practitioner.
There's a portion that I was like, I want to read this, which is interesting because your spirit is very welcoming. And I think it was even mentioned in the email that I read earlier. But there's a line in here that says, I don't tolerate being disrespected, nor do I sit by and silently allow others to be mistreated. And knowing you, I hear your voice in that.
Right.
And I see that part of you as well. I know you've touched on it a little bit, but what led to that, Ovell?
I would say that is a true reflection of me bringing my whole self to work. So if people are familiar with Grand Rapids, the park, the Martin Luther King Park, it used to be called Franklin Park. And in that generation, parents instilled in you that, you have to be able to, defend yourself. And you weren't going to be the kid on the block, like being chased home every day. It wasn't an option. And so I was also taught, both sets of my grandparents moved here from the South, part of the Great Migration, that, treat people in the manner that you want to be treated. So I wasn't the kid, my siblings, we weren't out starting stuff, but we certainly were told that, you had to be able to defend yourself. Yeah. So I mentioned that I, went to Creston. I was senior class president, voted best personality and friendliest. Mm-hmm. But, I always say, I reference it in a snarky way by saying, I do have the option of some park experiences. But as a leader, I think it's more important in terms of challenging the status quo. If you feel something isn't appropriate, you need to be able to express your opinion. So I like to be described as a, nice, congenial person. But in the discussions that I've had to participate in, those discussions aren't oftentimes, nice discussions.
I'm getting someone that says they've lost audio for Ovell. Let me know if you hear him come back in.
Hello?
So one question that we asked, or that has been asked is, are there audiobooks available yet?
The audiobook is definitively under construction. It will probably be available mid-October.
Okay.
Yep.
Mid-October. So audio will be available mid-October. And it sounds like we are back all set with sound. Thank you for letting us know. So there will be audiobooks available. Again, Ovell is here and will be here in our work cafe doing a book signing. So if you would like to make your way over here, you'll be able to see him live and in person and be able to purchase a book. It is a great read. It is one that I know personally. I was able to see myself in the pages and would encourage you to check them out. Is there any parting words of people that you would like to share with people on why they need to get their copy of The Big House?
I would say parting words. So I wasn't anticipating this question, but what I would say is that I want you to be inspired. If you personally have had an experience where you felt like you should have used your voice to say something, that's part one of the question. Part two, be very mindful in terms of the strength that we have as a collective community in building and preparing generations for the future. So those would be primary takeaways from the book. I encourage you to read The Big House and look me up if you have questions. My website is askovell.com with the tagline of, you ready for the tagline?
Let's hear it.
You better ask somebody.
I'm seeing a comment here from someone. Ovell, you have always been an inspiration here at Priority Health. So happy I was able to join virtually this morning.
Thank you to my Corewell employees and former colleagues.
So I typed in the name wrong. It's askovell.com. So I'm not seeing any additional questions online. And so we're going to go ahead and we are going to sign off here. So thank you all for joining us today. We'd love to have you join us for the next Diversity webinar taking place on Tuesday, October 31st. Registration is open. And then following the event, you'll receive a survey asking how likely you are to recommend this program to others. Your feedback is very important to us. So please take a few minutes to share your thoughts with us again. Ovell will be here for the next hour. So please come down and say hi, visit him in the Work Cafe, grab some coffee and be able to get your copy of The Big House. Hold on. One question just came in. I was hesitant to ask, but what can we do as coworkers is the question.
I would say so.
This person is not African-American. They wanted to say, I'm not African-American, but what can we do as coworkers?
I would say if you have specific questions of a coworker, then choose an appropriate forum to ask the question. It's like people have to be aware of environment, but minus dialogue, there's not going to be any progress to be made within organizations. But I would say be sensitive. If you have a specific question, then choose the best forum to ask the question, but don't miss an opportunity for personal growth. And as I shared earlier, I became a chief diversity officer and I wasn't steeped in DE&I. I had to learn the space. I was very vulnerable and a very public facing role.
Yeah, that's
a great question.
Really, really good question. So thank you for asking that. And yeah, so we again thank you all for joining us today. Again, Ovell, thank you so much for
Thank
taking
you,
the time to
Ata.
be with us today and for sharing this work with us. Really, honestly, I'm looking forward to going through this a second time because there was a lot of really good things. And even with that question, it brought up one of the stories that you share early on in the book about what to do and the experience you had with the gentleman that asked
The
you a
road
question.
rage.
Oh,
Oh,
not
no,
that
no.
one.
Okay.
Asked you a question in public.
Oh, yeah.
That
Mhm.
you know, like you
Mhm.
kind of gave him the stare. So I'll save some of those stories for you. There's some really the road rage story is another really good one. So really good stories. And thank you again for being with us. And we'll catch you at the next webinar series. And yes, you can purchase the book in person at the Work Cafe. There's many copies downstairs.